That's exactly right. I think that was a really great discussion. There's so much meat there and regarding sustainability and the regulations and the framework there. But in terms of getting down to data for retailers, um, why do you guys think data is so crucial in regards to returns and integration? You know, regulatory framework aside, individual merchants will want to improve their returns process. So why do we think that the data is so crucial here in regards to returns and integrations?
Well, I think there's two elements to this topic, and one of them is related to what we were just talking about in terms of the regulatory framework. And yeah, that regulatory framework may be immature in its enforcement, but at some point, the enforcement, much like GDPR in its early days, the enforcement will require retailers to prove that they've got sustainable returns processes and that they're tracking what is being returned, how it's being disposed of, and so on and so forth. But I think the other side of this question is what happens on the front end. And I mean, there's so many different ways that people return product. I mean, you can have the old school customer service where the customer phones up the retailer and says, I don't like the product, it's broken, or so and so. They get an RMA number, a return merchandise authorization number, they ship it back, and either there's a credit or a refund or there's a return product. In e-commerce, what's interesting, and I think probably apparel is one of the worst for this, is that in e-commerce, what we see now is people are implementing the return process right off the front end. So they're installing plugins that will look up the order, will select the line item that's being returned, and then generate the RMA automatically that gets either sent to the 3PL or it goes down to the retailer's ERP. And it also produces the labeling so that that product gets shipped back. And I know, Ben, you made a really interesting comment when we were first talking about this, that the whole shipping process around the returns was really to keep the product in the air as long as possible, because then you didn't have to deal with it. But I think the whole way that things are returned in North America, we have a velocity around this where things have to be returned quickly. I got to get my refund, or I'm going to get my exchange quickly. I just wonder whether the differences we see around the world, Ben, provide different velocities to the return process, and do we have the same attitudes around the data and where that data goes, or are these processes in complete isolation?
There are so many moving parts to this answer, right? It's but from a data perspective, it's difficult to know. I think you're probably familiar of the game of pin the tail on the donkey, and you're doing it blindfolded. It's almost difficult to know where to pin the tail on this. There are so many moving parts, but I think it's really important to remember that returns are anchored in customer experience to start with, right? And that if you don't provide your customer with the appropriate return experience, you ain't going to keep them. There's very, very little brand loyalty online. It's so easy to go from one merchant to another if particularly if you're shopping commodity products, and having a return process that people believe and that you can actually execute on is of critical importance. And I talk about the total cost of a return, and actually the total cost of a failed return would be a better point to start with. And a failed return actually starts with your customer having a bad experience. And what does a bad experience mean? Well, it can be something as simple as the tech not working and not generating a label, or most people don't actually have printers anymore in their homes, at least not over here. So it's how much, how does that process work? Am I emailing somebody a QR code, a barcode, or How does that work, and how inconvenient is that to the customer? The next part of it, and the only thing that they really care about then is, when am I getting my money back? You know,
Yeah.
and depending on the whole reverse logistics flow, there are various triggers that you'll know, Robin, that can trigger a refund. Whether it's the depot scan, once the last mile courier is handing it over to the return DC, whether it's doesn't happen there, but then happens further in when the packaging is opened and checked. What happens if that packaging is opened and checked in that country, and actually it then gets consolidated and flown all the way back? You're talking days and days and days. And where does that manifest itself in terms of a customer experience? Well, think about Net Promoter Score. Think about reviews. I mean, I'm a bit of a cynic where it comes to reviews, where I think most people that like to talk about reviews really go on there because they've got a gripe. And so all of that tends to then weigh against the performance of the website in terms of how well it converts new customers, and then how well it retains new customers. In terms of the data, it's how I think when I look at return data, I think it's how you use that data, and what decision it enables you to make at what point, and why are you making it? And I would always start from the fact that you spent a lot of money acquiring these customers. It makes sense to try and keep them happy, and that you should then build your systems around that. And I know we're going to talk about how the return process, I think, is broken. I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later on, but I do think that many retailers actually forget that this is a CX experience. It starts at CX, right? And then it morphs its way into an operational and a financial process.
No, I would completely agree with you. I think that the return experience, you're right. You've got a customer who's paid. Maybe they made a mistake in choosing the size, or what they ordered wasn't exactly what they wanted. I mean, you want to facilitate the return in such a way that it's economically viable, and that the customer gets the satisfaction. I think satisfaction is perceived, though, is that different geographies are going to look at the way that a return is being treated differently. And I think that this speaks to your point about the return process being broken. I think it's broken as well, in the sense that I don't think that you have, with a lot of retailers, the quality control when things are put back into inventory.
Yeah.
You have things that sit outright, particularly in fashion, where things are returned and they're just put into bins in the warehouse, and eventually somebody packages them up and sells them to a factoring agent, or they're disposed of.
Yeah. I mean, it's you made a great point earlier on about data being applied within the regulatory framework, and I think it speaks to a point around transparency generally.
Yes.
And I can foresee a time where there will be regulations in place, and I know that there are businesses out there that are working towards this already, that are looking and saying, well, we want to be able to identify every single component part of an item. We want to be able to visualize its whole journey, how it's used, and then ultimately when it's broken down. And I'm going to call out the Reverse Logistics Association in the US. There's a guy called Tony Shirota, who I'd recommend anybody that's listening to this, if you want to go and listen to someone that knows a bit about this, he's a good guy to connect. I remember him telling me, he introduced me to a professor in Italy, who gave a presentation at an RLA conference, and he talked about the concept of a car that was designed so that every single component part in this car was designed to be recycled at the end of the day. And if you take that to its logical extension, data is going to drive that, because you're going to need to be able to identify every single part in that vehicle, and identify its journey from production, usage, breakdown, potentially recycled and reused again, right? So data data and transparency for me are completely integrated. I mean, you talked about you talked about fashion. You know, fashion's got a huge problem. You know, and it's and again, I think it's almost a topic for a separate conversation. But until manufacturers and brands nail sizing, so that everybody knows what fits and what doesn't, you know, I don't see that problem being mitigated anytime soon. And then there's also what you want to fit and what you think fits and what actually fits are always different things anyway, right?
No, for sure. And then you've got vanity sizes thrown in for good measure. So
yeah, we've all got those in the wardrobe though, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. You know, your point about traceability in the returns process and the use of product. I mean, this is very much something that's come out of the aircraft industry, where parts are serialized, they're tracked, they've got expiry dates, they're taken out for maintenance, they're put back in, and they've got a lifespan with them, and then there's a whole recycling process around them. So you know, it's very expensive. And that's probably one of the reasons why aircraft cost so much, but you know, to me, it's an interesting process that could be applied here. So
yeah, I mean, you would think that technology over time is going to drive towards this in almost in every single vertical that people operate in, whether it's consumer or whether it's industrial. You know, I think that I don't see the door being closed on this. You know, the door's well and truly open.